fit out the Pilar as one of these boats. They were called Q boats, these civilian boats that were outfitted to, be camouflaged, if you will, looking for the enemy. So the Pilar, in fact, traveled or cruised under the guise of doing research for the American Natural History Museum. So enemy ships then, of course, would not recognize the Pilar as a threat and wouldn't waste their limited torpedoes. But Hemingway, true to his character, was not satisfied with a role so limited. He was frustrated by the fact that he was unable to mount 50-millimeter guns on the deck of the Pilar for the covert operation. Instead, he had to make do with light machine guns, hand grenades, and an onboard bazooka, none that would pose any threat to a German U-boat. But Hemingway came up with an interesting idea. Every once in a while, these German U-boats would have to surface. And when they surfaced, sometimes if there was local fishing boats, they would go out to the local fishing boats and take their fish or their produce or whatever they had on board for a supply of fresh food. So on those occasions, when they surface and open up the top to get out and to go essentially steal the food from local fishermen, Hemingway hired a high-life player he knew in Cuba in order to have him take grenades. And when and if this ever happened, because this guy was such an experienced high-life player, the idea was as soon as they open up the top, the high-life player would take a grenade and throw it in to try and blow up the U-boat. Well, it never did happen, but that was the plan. Well, you got to give it credit. It was original. So that was his secret weapon. The high-life player's name was Patchy. Well, when America fully entered the European complex, his third wife, Margaret, dragged Hemingway to the European conflict, leaving behind the days of deep-sea fishing and his Cuban lifestyle in exchange for covering D-Day and the liberation of Paris. By the end of the war, his third marriage was now over, and he was about to have his fourth marriage to a lady named Mary Welsh, who, of course, almost as always, was a journalist. So he met Mary Welsh, a very petite woman from Minnesota in London. So Hemingway got divorced from Martha in 1946, returned to Cuba with Mary, exchanged vows, and shared his Cuban home there with some 57 cats. And Mary. Okay. Well, Hemingway, again, he had this particular fondness for polydactyl cats. So these are cats with more, actually not just 6 toes, but more than 5 toes on their feet. And they were considered good luck by sailors. That's why he had so many of them. Because sailors, at the time, they thought the extra digits on these cats gave them an advantage in killing shipboard rats. So while Hemingway was certainly aware of the meaning of polydactyl cats, had a great affinity for them, this part of the legend, which insists that he introduced the cats to the White House streets back in Key West, isn't exactly true. But in true Hemingway tradition, why let the facts get in the way of a good story, huh? So he did, however, introduce polydactyl cats to his next home, which was in Cuba, located just the other side of the Gulf Stream, of course. So here are some of the cats, and here you can see a picture of one with 7 toes. Well, in 1950, never really happy with any activity unless some sort of contest was involved. Obviously, he was a very competitive man. Hemingway started the International Marlin Tournament. 10 years later, this competition was named after him. Though he resisted, he really didn't want to have it named after himself. In fact, they called it a lousy posthumous tribute to a lousy living writer. Kind of a weird statement. It doesn't reflect him having a very high opinion of his own writing abilities, in my opinion. However, the first prize that year was won by none other than Fidel Castro. So here you can see Ernest congratulating Fidel on his catch. So Mary, well, his young and eager wife during the 1950s was also very enthusiastic about travel. So now they traveled to Asia to cover some conflicts over there. It is in these travels that his thoughts began to reflect back to his beloved Gulf Stream and to a story that he initially conceived as far back as 1936. So partly inspired by his Cuban captain, Gregorio Fuentes, part personal experience, and his own physical struggles to land the big fish and the mental struggles of the one that got away, Hemingway then completed his most famous work based in the tropical water, The Old Man and the Sea, in 1951. Actually, it was initially serialized in Time magazine. So it was not a full-blown novel, it was a novella, but like his other work, it was written with coarse phrases, blunt description that had become his trademark over the years. So The Struggle, The Old Man came out at the right time. It met a very receptive audience after being serialized in Time magazine. Well, then, of course, it was published in book form, and Old Man and the Sea won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature in 1953. So he also won another Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954. There was 2 Pulitzer Prizes actually awarded him for Old Man and the Sea. But he never accepted the one in 1954. Instead, he decided to give it to the people of Cuba, who influenced the story in his writing. So again, at this point, he had truly, truly reached the apex of his career. How could he outdo himself at this point? How much higher could he take his talents? Where else could he go with his talents as a writer and all of his stories and all of his adventures and all of his different relationships? Well, he did continue to write, but he never traveled again. After achieving the critical acclaim that he had around The Old Man and the Sea, he just felt apparently like he couldn't take it anywhere higher or any place different. So, and remember, this is a man who carefully cultivated his image as a sportsman, and let's face it, as a womanizer, a man of action, a real man's man. So with a persona that not even he felt he could live up to anymore. He had many different physical ailments from injuries suffered in wartime. He had been involved in some airplane crashes. He'd been involved in some other accidents. And also, unfortunately and sadly, he had inherited some of the mental illness that his father had as well. So 7 years later, after receiving the highest literary prize in the world, Hemingway, whom had now moved to Ketchum, Idaho, sat down at his desk, pulled out a shotgun, and put his life to an end at the age of 61. So Ernest Hemingway, let's face it, he's not only a great American writer, he was a storyteller for the world. That's why we're having this presentation. His blood-pulsing prose shared stories from Europe, Africa, and America, reflecting his desire to milk the globe for adventure. But it was only along the edge of the Gulf Stream and the Caribbean Sea that Hemingway only truly felt at home, living and playing there for pretty much the majority of his adult life. But he has shown us, who are now literally and figuratively sailing in the wake of Hemingway, that genuinely rich adventures can be had cruising through the waters of either the Pacific or the Atlantic Oceans or the Indian Ocean or any ocean for that matter. So that, folks, is the story of Ernest Hemingway briefly. I hope you enjoyed it, learned something, and I hope it inspires you to write or read some of his works if you haven't read some. Thank you all very much for coming.